In 1949, Mao Zedong, leader of the Chinese Communist Party, rose to power after years of civil war. The momentous occasion was marked by the founding of the People's Republic of China, a new chapter for a nation long exploited by warlords, foreign powers, and imperialists. Mao, the hero of the revolution, promised to uplift the masses and bring them prosperity, casting off centuries of oppression. His charisma and vision for a socialist paradise brought hope to millions of destitute peasants. But what started as hope quickly turned to despair. Within less than a decade, Mao's ambition and the methods he used to bring about his dream of a socialist utopia led to the death of millions. The policies enacted under his leadership were not just political missteps, they were calculated, relentless, and indifferent to human life. In particular, his desire to industrialize and modernize China through the Great Leap Forward would be one of the most devastating and catastrophic policies in history. What began as a dream turned into a nightmare, and the reality of Mao's legacy would be written in the blood of over 45 million people. In 1958, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, an audacious plan designed to catapult China into economic modernity. The vision was grand. Within 15 years, China would surpass both the United Kingdom and the United States in industrial output. Mao believed that through sheer force of will and the mass mobilization of China's peasantry, the nation could achieve the impossible. Dare to think, dare to act became the mantra that drove this movement. The Great Leap Forward was rooted in two main components: collectivization and industrialization. Mao's obsession with surpassing the West drove the communist regime to implement radical changes. In the countryside, private farming was abolished, and land was consolidated into enormous communes where resources, labor, and even daily meals were shared. The communal kitchens were not just about efficiency, they were about erasing individuality, a collective existence where every waking hour was dedicated to work. Simultaneously, Mao ordered the construction of tens of thousands of small backyard furnaces intended to produce steel at an industrial scale. Peasants were coerced into abandoning their fields to produce steel, often smelting down household items, farming tools, and even pots and pans in a desperate attempt to meet the impossible quotas set by the state. Forests were leveled to fuel these furnaces, and what came out was often brittle and useless. Yet the charade continued as false reports of success circulated throughout the nation. At first, enthusiasm ran high. Party cadres pushed production targets ever higher, while officials at every level, fearing Mao's wrath, exaggerated successes to avoid punishment. It wasn't long before local officials were reporting record grain harvests, figures that were nothing but lies. However, in a system where reporting bad news was equated to disloyalty, no one dared to speak the truth. Mao remained in his palace, blissfully unaware of the disaster that was about to engulf his nation. Beneath the layer of propaganda and lies, the countryside was descending into chaos. By 1959, many regions of rural China were already facing severe food shortages. The communal kitchens, once seen as symbols of socialist efficiency, had turned into places of desperation. Crops withered in the fields as peasants pulled away from agriculture to work on infrastructure projects and smelt steel were unable to tend to their land. What little food was produced was taken by the state, leaving villages with almost nothing. In regions like Henan and Anhui, peasants began resorting to desperate measures. The countryside became a place of eerie silence as villages emptied of people, some dying in their homes, others leaving in search of food. For many, starvation was an agonizing, drawn-out process. Eyewitnesses recall seeing villagers reduced to eating tree bark, roots, and even soil. Anything that could be swallowed, no matter how indigestible, was consumed in a futile attempt to stave off hunger. The collective kitchens, once seen as symbols of the new socialist order, had become centers of despair. Cannibalism, once unthinkable, began to spread as families faced impossible choices. In some areas, Parents would offer their dying children as food to their neighbors, unable to bear watching them suffer. The stories are both shocking and heart-wrenching, tales of mothers who, in their final moments, urged their starving children to eat what little remained of their bodies to survive. Despite these horrific conditions, the state continued to take what little grain the peasants had managed to produce. Mao's insistence on meeting export obligations to the Soviet Union and paying off China's debts meant that the countryside was being bled dry. Villages that had reported bountiful harvests were now forced to give up grain that didn't exist. The government, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the truth, demanded quotas be met, no matter the cost. Mao Zedong was not oblivious to the suffering of his people. Reports of famine reached his ears as early as 1959, but his response was one of shocking indifference. Rather than adjust the policies that were driving millions to starvation, Mao doubled down. In his mind, the end justifies the means. He saw the sacrifices made by the rural peasants as a necessary price to pay for the greater good. It is better to let half the people die so that the other half can eat their fill, Mao reportedly said during a Politburo meeting. His words reflect the cold calculus that guided his policies. Human lives were expendable in the pursuit of progress. In the spring of 1959, Mao ordered the requisition of even more grain from already starving provinces. He saw the countryside as a resource to be exploited, its people sacrificed to feed the growing urban centers and fuel the industrial projects that would define China's future. Trucks were dispatched across the nation to confiscate grain from the communes, even as people collapsed from hunger in the fields. Mao's top lieutenants, fearful of defying their leader, echoed his indifference. As grain was taken from starving peasants, reports from officials at every level of government continued to paint a rosy picture of success. No one dared speak of the death toll, and the famine was kept hidden from the wider world. Yet behind the propaganda, the reality was devastating. In Henan, one of the hardest-hit provinces, entire villages were wiped out. Of the region's 10 million people, over 1 million died from starvation. In one village, it was reported that bodies lined the streets, their stomachs bloated from eating grass and leaves, while others were too weak even to bury the dead. As 1960 approached, the famine deepened across China's rural provinces. Despite the promises of socialist prosperity, the villages were left to rot. Families, once hopeful under the promises of collectivization, now faced the brutal reality of starvation. Crops failed under mismanaged farming techniques dictated by the Communist Party, and grain stores were emptied by local officials eager to please Mao by meeting exaggerated quotas. Survivors of the famine describe a landscape of desolation. Fields lay barren, with crops having been abandoned or left to rot. The communal kitchens, intended to provide nourishment, were closed as food supplies dwindled. Villagers huddled in their homes, too weak to work, let alone protest. It was common to see entire households succumb to hunger one by one, until only silence remained within their walls. One farmer from Anhui province recalled watching his neighbors slowly die of starvation. He described a once thriving village reduced to ghostly silence. "At first we tried to help each other," he said, "but soon there was nothing to give. We couldn't even bury the dead. We didn't have the strength." This tragic scene repeated across the country as even the most basic human dignity, burial, became an impossible task. It wasn't just food that had been taken from the peasants. Everything of value was confiscated, melted down, or seized by the state in the pursuit of Mao's industrial dream. Even the simplest tools that could have been used to grow food were gone. Pots, pans, and even farming equipment were smelted in the absurd backyard furnaces, producing useless scrap metal in the name of steel production. In a cruel twist of irony, the very objects that could have saved lives were destroyed to fuel an ideological fantasy. Despite the growing death toll, few dared to speak out. Mao's regime had fostered a climate of absolute fear, where dissent was equated with treason. To criticize the policies of the Great Leap Forward was to risk being branded a counter-revolutionary, a crime punishable by death or forced labor. Party officials at all levels, desperate to protect their careers and avoid Mao's wrath, falsified reports and buried the truth. The political purges following the 100 Flowers campaign had already demonstrated Mao's willingness to ruthlessly crush any opposition. Intellectuals, scholars, and even government officials who voiced concern about the direction of the country had been labeled rightists, stripped of their positions, and sent to labor camps. The fear of being accused of treason was pervasive, and as the famine grew worse, the silence became deafening. One of the few who dared to speak was Peng Dehuai, a veteran military leader who had been instrumental in China's victory during the Korean War. After visiting his home province in 1959 and witnessing the suffering firsthand, Peng was appalled by the devastation. In an open letter to Mao, he criticized the policies of the Great Leap Forward, urging the chairman to reconsider the direction in which the country was headed. Peng's letter was a rare act of defiance, but it came at a great personal cost. Mao, enraged by Peng's audacity, labeled him a traitor and orchestrated his removal from power. Peng was humiliated at a series of public trials, stripped of his military rank, and banished from the political arena. His fall sent a clear message to anyone who might have considered speaking out. Defiance would not be tolerated. The silencing of Peng Dehuai marked a turning point in the famine. With no one left to challenge Mao, the policies of the Great Leap Forward continued unabated. Local officials, terrified of losing their positions, continued to report exaggerated harvest figures, even as entire regions starved. False reports of bumper crops circulated through the party, creating the illusion that the Great Leap Forward was succeeding. But beneath the facade of progress, China was starving. By 1960, the famine had reached catastrophic proportions. Tens of millions were already dead, yet Mao remained fixated on his industrial ambitions. The countryside, home to hundreds of millions of peasants, was viewed as expendable in the grand scheme of the Communist Party's goals. Mao was willing to sacrifice the rural population if it meant achieving his vision of a modernized, industrialized China. Mao's strategy was clear. The countryside would bear the brunt of the suffering to ensure that the cities and industrial centers continued to thrive. Grain, the lifeblood of the rural population, was diverted from the starving provinces to feed the urban centers and meet export demands. Even as reports of starvation poured in from the provinces, Mao ordered that grain procurement be increased. In March 1959, during a Politburo session, Mao coldly remarked, "When there is not enough to eat, people starve to death. It is better to let half of the people die so that the other half can eat their fill." This chilling statement encapsulated Mao's willingness to let millions perish if it served the greater good of the party's goals. It wasn't incompetence or ignorance that drove the famine. It was a calculated decision to prioritize industrial output over human lives. To ensure that the urban population remained fed, the state imposed strict travel restrictions on the rural population. Peasants were forbidden from leaving their villages in search of food, and those who attempted to flee were captured and sent back to starve. The countryside became a prison, and the peasants its captives. The death toll from the Great Leap Forward is staggering. Estimates vary, but most historians agree that at least 45 million people died between 1958 and 1962. In some provinces, as much as one-third of the population perished. Entire villages disappeared, their inhabitants either dead or too weak to survive. In Henan province, the famine reached such a scale that local officials reported bodies lining the streets unburied and decomposing under the sun. The air was thick with the stench of death, and the rivers were clogged with the corpses of those who had tried to escape. Those who survived were often left physically and psychologically scarred, their bodies emaciated and their spirits broken. Cannibalism became a tragic reality in many parts of the country. In Hunan province, a father was forced to bury his own son alive after the boy stole a handful of grain. Driven mad by hunger and fear, people turned on each other, with neighbors devouring the bodies of the dead to stay alive. In some cases, parents consumed the bodies of their own children, a horrifying act that underscored the sheer desperation of the famine. As the famine intensified, acts of cannibalism became a haunting reality in many parts of China. The horrors of starvation broke down the very fabric of human dignity, forcing people to make unimaginable decisions in their quest to survive. Entire families succumbed to the famine, and the desperate act of consuming human flesh, once a distant nightmare, became a final, terrifying resort for many. In the provinces of Henan, Hunan, and Anhui, cannibalism was reported on a large scale. A village elder in Henan recalled a scene he would never forget. "I came across the body of a child no more than 5 or 6 years old. The legs had been eaten down to the bone, and the rest of the body was left to rot." Such scenes became disturbingly common, with parents sometimes consuming the bodies of their own children to stave off death. Cannibalism was not limited to the dead. In some cases, those still alive were targeted. These acts, while horrific, were born out of sheer desperation, a society driven to madness by the insatiable hunger that gripped them. Yet even as these atrocities were committed, the state maintained its stranglehold on the narrative. Local officials, aware that reporting such horrors would be seen as an indictment of Mao's policies, concealed the scale of the cannibalism from the central government. The few that dared to speak out were silenced, labeled as counter-revolutionaries, and dealt with harshly. One of the most tragic aspects of the Great Leap Forward was the deliberate policy of privileging urban centers over the countryside. Mao and the Communist Party saw the cities as the future of China, a symbol of the industrial might they wished to project to the world. As a result, the famine was disproportionately borne by rural areas, which were systematically drained of their resources to sustain the urban population. Grain and other foodstuffs, desperately needed in the provinces, were instead sent to the cities or exported abroad to repay debts to the Soviet Union. Mao's government was adamant that China would not lose face on the international stage, even if it meant millions of its own people would perish. The countryside was bled dry as crops and livestock were requisitioned, leaving the rural population with nothing but scraps. In cities like Beijing and Shanghai, the reality of the famine was hidden from view. While the countryside starved, urban citizens enjoyed a semblance of normalcy, though they too faced rationing. The urban elite, particularly high-ranking party members and government officials, lived in relative comfort, shielded from the horrors taking place in the fields. Party banquets continued in opulent surroundings with ample food and drink, while the peasants who provided the grain were dying in the millions. The divide between urban and rural China became stark. Those in the cities, particularly the intellectuals and technocrats who had been targeted during the 100 Flowers campaign, were kept in line through fear and ignorance. Most had little understanding of the scale of the famine or the suffering endured by their rural counterparts. Meanwhile, the peasants were trapped, their villages turned into death camps where escape was forbidden. As millions starved, Mao Zedong remained committed to his vision. To him, the deaths of peasants were collateral damage in the pursuit of a socialist utopia. His focus was not on alleviating the suffering, but on fulfilling his dream of overtaking Western powers through industrial might. Steel production remained at the heart of this dream, and despite the clear failures of the backyard furnaces, Mao refused to abandon the project. The steel produced by these small makeshift furnaces was almost entirely useless. It was often brittle, impure, and unsuitable for industrial use. Yet local officials, terrified of being seen as failing Mao, continued to produce it in vast quantities. The furnaces burned day and night, consuming precious fuel while the resulting metal was simply discarded. Mao's obsession with producing more steel than the United Kingdom blinded him to the reality that his country was on the brink of collapse. In one infamous instance, party officials staged a propaganda photo of peasants standing on a bed of wheat so dense it could supposedly hold the weight of several men. This image, plastered across state newspapers, was meant to showcase the success of the agricultural policies. But the reality behind the image was far more sinister. The field was a farce, constructed for the photograph, and the grain was a fraction of what was claimed. Such acts of deception became common as party cadres scrambled to avoid punishment by faking success. The famine, which could have been mitigated by a change in policy, instead continued to escalate. As Mao's grip on power tightened, so too did the suffering of the people. Starvation, disease, and violence became endemic across rural China. But the party maintained its deafening silence. For Mao, the deaths of millions were a price worth paying to achieve his grand vision. By 1962, the famine had reached its peak, and even Mao could no longer ignore the catastrophe unfolding across China. The death toll was staggering. Estimates range from 36 million to over 45 million dead, a number almost incomprehensible in its scale. It was one of the deadliest man-made disasters in history, rivaling the death toll of World War II. Yet the famine remained shrouded in secrecy, a taboo topic that the Chinese government would work to bury for decades to come. As the famine slowly subsided, driven by small-scale reforms that allowed some privatization of agriculture, the true extent of the devastation was never fully acknowledged by the party. Mao himself downplayed the severity of the famine, attributing it to natural causes rather than the failed policies of the Great Leap Forward. The Communist Party worked tirelessly to suppress any information about the famine, and those who attempted to investigate or speak out were silenced. One of the few to break this silence was a journalist and historian named Yang Jisheng, whose monumental work, Tombstone, exposed the truth behind the famine. Published in 2008, the book was banned in mainland China, but it remains one of the most comprehensive accounts of the tragedy. Yang, whose own father died of starvation during the Great Leap Forward, spent years collecting testimonies from survivors and accessing state archives to piece together the truth. Yang's work, like that of others who have sought to uncover the reality of the famine, remains a powerful testament to the resilience of those who survived and the determination to remember those who did not. Yet, despite these efforts, the famine remains a difficult and sensitive topic in China today. Official recognition of the tragedy is still largely absent, and Mao Zedong's legacy as the founding father of modern China continues to overshadow the horrors of the Great Leap Forward. Mao Zedong remains a polarizing figure in both Chinese and global history. To many, he is still revered as the man who liberated China from imperialism and founded the People's Republic. His image adorns banknotes, statues, and portraits, and he is celebrated as a national hero by the Communist Party. Yet, beneath this carefully crafted image lies the dark truth of his rule: the deaths of millions during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution that followed. Historians continued to debate the extent of Mao's responsibility for the famine. Some argue that he was a product of the times, driven by an ideological fervor that blinded him to the human cost of his policies. Others, however, place the blame squarely on his shoulders, labeling him one of the greatest mass murderers in history. Regardless of where one stands on this issue, it is undeniable that Mao's policies during the Great Leap Forward directly led to the deaths of tens of millions of people. For those who survived the Great Leap Forward, the scars left by the famine were both physical and psychological. The rural population, once full of hope for a better future under Mao's leadership, had been decimated. Families were torn apart, villages emptied, and entire regions left in ruin. The famine was not just a humanitarian disaster, it was a betrayal of the very people who had supported Mao's revolution. Yet, despite the overwhelming evidence of his responsibility for the catastrophe, Mao's image as the great helmsman persisted. The Chinese Communist Party carefully managed his legacy, focusing on his role in uniting China and defeating foreign powers. His failures, particularly the famine, were downplayed or attributed to external factors. In official narratives, natural disasters and the sabotage of counter-revolutionaries were often blamed for the famine, while Mao's policies were portrayed as bold, but tragically misunderstood. For Mao, maintaining his image as the father of modern China was paramount. In the years following the famine, he sought to reassert his control over the party and the country, leading to the Cultural Revolution, a campaign of purges, violence, and chaos that would claim even more lives. Mao's ruthlessness in dealing with dissent and his insistence on ideological purity ensured that no one could challenge his version of history. Those who did, such as Liu Shaoqi, a high-ranking party official who had privately criticized Mao's handling of the famine, were purged, imprisoned, and, in Liu's case, left to die in miserable conditions. Mao's cult of personality was so deeply ingrained in Chinese society that even after his death in 1976, the party struggled with how to reconcile his image with the undeniable atrocities of his reign. Deng Xiaoping, who succeeded Mao and led China into an era of economic reform, acknowledged that mistakes had been made during the Great Leap Forward, but stopped short of directly condemning Mao. The official verdict delivered at the CCP's 1981 Congress was that Mao was 70% correct and 30% wrong. This ambiguous assessment allowed the party to maintain its reverence for Mao while distancing itself from the most disastrous aspects of his rule. But for historians and the families of the millions who perished, the question remains, can Mao's achievements justify the human cost of his policies? Mao's revolution may have united China and freed it from imperialism, but at what price? The death toll from the famine and the political purges that followed places Mao alongside other 20th century figures such as Stalin and Hitler, leaders whose ideological ambitions led to unimaginable human suffering. While Mao's personal responsibility for the famine is clear, the role of the Chinese Communist Party in perpetuating the disaster cannot be overlooked. The famine was not the result of a single man's actions, but of a system that placed absolute loyalty to the party above all else. The CCP's strict hierarchical structure, coupled with its culture of fear and suppression of dissent, created an environment where truth was sacrificed for political endurance. Local officials, desperate to avoid being labeled as disloyal or incompetent, falsified reports of grain production, leading to widespread shortages and the mass starvation that followed. The party's insistence on ideological purity meant that any criticism of Mao's policies was seen as treason. Those who dared to speak out like Peng Dehuai were silenced, and the few who recognized the scale of the disaster lacked the power to effect change. The party's collective responsibility for the famine extends beyond the leadership. The bureaucratic machinery of the CCP, from local cadres to regional governors, played a role in enforcing policies that directly contributed to the famine. The obsession with meeting quotas and adhering to Mao's vision, no matter how unrealistic, led to the mass confiscation of grain, forced labor, and the brutal repression of dissent. The party's apparatus was complicit in creating the conditions that allowed the famine to spiral out of control. This collective responsibility has made it difficult for the CCP to fully acknowledge the extent of the famine. Admitting to the failure of the Great Leap Forward would not only tarnish Mao's legacy, but also undermine the legitimacy of the party itself. For decades, the CCP has maintained a careful balance between celebrating Mao's achievements and downplaying his failures, ensuring that the full truth of the famine remains obscure. Other scholars have also worked to break the silence surrounding the famine. Chinese historians, such as Frank de Cotter, have painstakingly pieced together the truth, often relying on interviews, local archives, and personal testimonies from those who lived through the famine. These accounts paint a vivid picture of the scale of the disaster, the suffering of the people, and the complicity of the party in covering it up. The bravery of those who have spoken out cannot be overstated. In a country where criticizing the party can result in imprisonment or worse, those who have dedicated their lives to preserving the memory of the famine do so at great personal risk. Yet, for many, the desire to ensure that the victims of the famine are not forgotten outweighs the fear of reprisal. Despite these efforts, the Great Famine remains a largely taboo subject in China. The CCP's control over the media and education system ensures that younger generations know little of the famine's true scale. Official histories still gloss over the period, focusing on the successes of the Communist Revolution and Mao's role in founding the People's Republic while sidestepping the atrocities of the Great Leap Forward. One of the most striking aspects of the famine was the muted response from the international community. While millions were dying in China, the world remained largely unaware of the scale of the disaster. This was in part due to the CCP's tight control over information and its deliberate efforts to project an image of success to the outside world. Western journalists and diplomats visiting China were shown carefully curated scenes of abundance and prosperity, while the famine-ravaged countryside was kept out of view. In 1961, French politician François Mitterrand visited China and declared that there was no famine in China, repeating the reassurances given to him by Mao's government. Similarly, many Western journalists who toured the country during this period reported on the progress of the Great Leap Forward, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the suffering taking place in the rural provinces. There were, however, some warnings. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who had initially supported Mao's push for collectivization, became increasingly concerned as reports of the famine reached him. He warned Mao not to repeat the mistakes of Stalinist collectivization, but Mao, convinced of his own righteousness, ignored these warnings. By 1960, relations between China and the Soviet Union had soured, and Soviet advisors were withdrawn, leaving China isolated on the world stage. The international community's failure to recognize or respond to the famine can also be attributed to the broader geopolitical context of the Cold War. With China emerging as a key player in the global balance of power, particularly as relations with the Soviet Union deteriorated, many Western nations were hesitant to criticize Mao's government too harshly. The result was a global silence, as millions died in one of the worst man-made disasters in history. The Great Leap Forward stands as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked ideological zeal and authoritarian rule. Mao's obsession with rapid industrialization and collectivization, driven by his desire to surpass the West, led to one of the deadliest famines in history. The policies of the Great Leap Forward were not just misguided, they were imposed with a brutal disregard for human life, sacrificing millions in the name of progress. The famine also highlights the fragility of truth in authoritarian regimes. Mao's government systematically suppressed information about the famine, and local officials, terrified of retribution, falsified reports to meet quotas. The result was a vast network of lies and deception that allowed the famine to spiral out of control. The fear of dissent, coupled with the party's need to maintain absolute control, meant that millions of lives were lost before the true scale of the disaster was acknowledged. One of the most chilling aspects of the Great Leap Forward was the way in which ideology blinded the Chinese leadership to the suffering of its people. Mao's utopian vision of a socialist paradise where everyone would share equally in the fruits of collective labor was not just a fantasy, it was an obsession. And in the pursuit of that obsession, Mao refused to allow reality to intrude on his plans. This is what made the famine not only a failure of policy, but a catastrophe driven by ideology. The party's commitment to Marxist-Leninist principles became a prison, where questioning Mao's vision meant betraying the revolution. The communal farming and forced collectivization that were supposed to increase productivity instead did the opposite, leading to disastrous agricultural outcomes. But rather than adjust course, the party leadership remained trapped in their belief that the only way forward was to double down on the policies that were already failing. Mao's China had become a state where truth was subservient to ideology. When local officials reported inflated production figures to meet party targets, those reports were accepted at face value, even as villages were emptied by starvation. In such a system, the truth of what was happening in the countryside became irrelevant as long as the illusion of progress was maintained. The peasants, who were meant to be the foundation of Mao's revolution, were sacrificed to protect the lie. Mao's famine is not just a tragedy confined to Chinese history. It offers important lessons for the world about the dangers of authoritarianism, the consequences of unchecked power, and the devastating effects of ideological extremism. Throughout the 20th century, similar tragedies unfolded in other parts of the world, from Stalin's forced collectivization in the Soviet Union to the Khmer Rouge's reign of terror in Cambodia. The Great Leap Forward underscores the importance of accountability in governance. Mao's unchecked authority, combined with the fear that permeated the party, allowed a catastrophe to unfold without any meaningful opposition. Local officials, terrified of contradicting Mao, perpetuated a system of lies that led to the deaths of millions. This illustrates the dangers of a political system that stifles dissent and discourages open debate. The famine also highlights the consequences of placing ideology above practical reality. Mao's commitment to rapid industrialization and collectivization, driven by his desire to prove China's superiority over the West, blinded him to the human cost of his policies. In pursuing his ideological goals, Mao failed to recognize the limits of his own system and the suffering of his people. The Great Leap Forward also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of centralized power and the suppression of truth. In China, Mao's position as the unchallenged leader meant that his vision for the country went unchecked, no matter how disastrous the results. Local officials, even when aware of the catastrophic consequences of Mao's policies, felt unable to speak the truth, fearing they would be branded traitors. The layers of deception enforced by fear led to an echo chamber of falsehoods that resulted in the deaths of millions. Amid the statistics and historical analysis, it is important to remember the individual lives lost and the survivors who still carry the scars of the famine. The true scope of the tragedy is not just in the millions who died, but in the millions who lived through it, bearing witness to one of the darkest periods in Chinese history. Survivors of the famine have shared stories that are as haunting as they are heartbreaking. In village after village, the stories were the same. Children dying in their mother's arms, entire families disappearing overnight, and desperate acts of survival that haunt those who lived through them. Many survivors, now elderly, still struggle with the memories of what they endured. For China, confronting the legacy of the Great Famine is not just a question of historical truth, it is a question of national identity. The Chinese Communist Party, which still holds Mao in high regard, must reckon with the fact that one of its greatest leaders was also responsible for one of its greatest tragedies. Yet doing so would require a fundamental shift in how the party views its own history. Reckoning with the famine would involve more than just acknowledging the mistakes of the past. It would require a deeper reflection on the nature of power, ideology, and the role of the state. The famine was not just a result of poor planning or natural disasters. It was the product of a political system that prioritized ideology over human life, that silenced dissent, and that allowed one man's vision to override the needs of millions. For many in China, the memory of the famine is a painful reminder of the dangers of unchecked power. It is a cautionary tale about what can happen when the state becomes too powerful, when ideology becomes more important than people, and when dissent is crushed in the name of national unity. For the survivors, the famine is a wound that has never fully healed, a tragedy that continues to shape their view of the world and the government. Yet the party has shown little interest in confronting this legacy. Mao remains a revered figure, and the famine is still largely treated as a historical footnote. As China continues to rise as a global power, the party's focus remains on projecting strength and stability, and admitting to the full extent of the famine could undermine that image. However, as China's society continues to evolve, there may come a time when the country is ready to confront its past. The work of historians like Yang Jisheng, combined with the stories of survivors, has already started to chip away at the official narrative. While the party may still control the public memory of the famine, the truth is slowly emerging, and with it, the possibility of a reckoning. For China, the legacy of the famine is complex. On one hand, the country has made remarkable progress since the 1960s, transforming itself from a largely agrarian society into a global economic powerhouse. But on the other hand, the memory of the famine casts a long shadow over the party's claims to legitimacy. The lives lost during the Great Leap Forward are a testament to the dangers of ideological extremism and the cost of centralized power. For the survivors, the famine is a wound that will never fully heal. The trauma of those years, the loss of loved ones, and the sheer scale of the suffering continue to haunt those who lived through it. Their stories serve as a powerful reminder of the human cost of political ambition, and they stand as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable hardship. The memory of the famine also raises important questions for the future. Mao Zedong's Great Famine is a tragic reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of accountability in government. So as China continues to grow and assert its power on the global stage, how will it reckon with its past? Will the truth of the famine ever be fully acknowledged? And what lessons can the world learn from this tragedy to ensure that such a disaster never happens again? Thanks for watching, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this historical tragedy in the comments below. Don't forget to check out my other videos for more insights into other fascinating history.